Welcome to Disruptive Successor, a show for next generation leaders in family businesses and entrepreneurs who want to disrupt the status quo and take their existing business to a whole new level. We all know that what got us here isn't going to get us there. This show will provide inspiration, advice, and resources to help you create massive impact. This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Hi, it's Jonathan Goldhill, and welcome back to another episode of the Disruptive Successor Show. Today's show is about difficult conversations, specifically how to have them, when to have them, and why to have them. In the workplace, a difficult conversation scenario could involve asking for a pay increase, addressing being micromanaged by a boss, delivering or receiving a disappointing performance evaluation, or how to talk to an underperforming coworker. But in family enterprises, having difficult conversations is particularly important because discussions not had can cause a business to falter. The types of conversation I'm talking about in family business can include conversations involving succession, money, prenups, family employment policies, compensation and dividends, ownership, exit plans, and more. Not being open and having conversations about these topics can lead to misunderstandings and lack of trust. So what is a difficult conversation? It's a planned discussion about an uncomfortable topic or a negative experience where the goal is to share different perspectives, build mutual understanding, and develop respect, not to persuade or win. My guest today is a returning guest. Maryann G. was featured in episode 153, where she spoke with me about the importance of prenups in safeguarding business owners. Maryann is a partner at Wingspan Legacy Partners, a family business advisory firm where she helps enterprising families create their legacies. She has a deep understanding of the structures needed to design governance and policy for multi-generational, family-owned enterprises. Ms. Bell has a long career at Goldman Sachs in New York, Boston, and London. After earning an MBA from Harvard University, she is a philanthropic leader in Austin, Texas, and an experienced governance authority, having chaired 7 boards. Maryann, welcome to the show today.
Excited to be back. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's great. Sorry, I bumbled a little bit. That's first thing in the morning here, and we're just getting going. So there's an enormous transfer of assets happening as we speak between baby boomers and the next generation in families. I think it's happening around the world, certainly in the US, and this is giving rise to a host of challenges for both the boomers and the next generation. I'd like you to first start by telling us a little bit about your experience in this area before we get into the why, the how, and the what about difficult conversations.
Well, Jonathan, you just touched on, I think, one of the most important issues that we all need to be aware of, that there's a tremendous asset transfer happening already. We just did a conference in Dubai with the rising or next gen community, and the statistics that we shared during that was we expect close to $20 trillion of assets to be transferred, both in business assets and liquid assets, from the boomer generation to the next millennial or Gen X, Gen Zs. And just to put that in context, the U.S. GDP for last year was $26 trillion. The global GDP last year was $105 trillion. So we're talking about 20% of the entire global GDP from last year will be transferred in the next 5 to 10 years. So that's a 10% uptick annually if you amortize it across the 10-year period. But what that really means is that there's a tremendous amount of assets, money, and resources being transferred. And what we want is the receivers of these assets to be responsible owners. We want them to be able to have agency and knowledge and capabilities to be able to steward those assets, whether it's in an operating role or just investing both in their communities and investing in new businesses and enterprises. So many of these families and enterprises that we work with have been rooted in entrepreneurial spirits, and so we want that to continue in the next generation.
It's interesting. I think about 5 years ago, I wrote a blog after seeing someone else's blog talking about a tsunami of businesses that were going to transfer. And I don't think I really saw it happen quite the way I thought it was. And I think part of it is because owners are holding on longer and maybe even half retiring. And not transferring the ownership of the business. And part of, I think, what we're going to talk about today, I'm witnessing firsthand in at least one of my clients, where the baton that is being passed from one generation to the next is getting sticky. And part of it is just the lack of communication and clarity in the communications and the sequencing of steps of where do we go from where we are today to where you say you're going to be in 3 to 5 years. Like, let's talk about that. And it's these conversations that aren't happening that become the problem. And I think people like us are the conduit to create that, facilitate that conversation.
Jonathan, you're completely right. It's, when our Wingspan started almost 4 years ago, and we've spoken to hundreds of families all over the world. And the most common phrase that we hear, now every family is different, every dynamic is different, but the most common phrase that we hear from both rising gen, next gen, now gen, those who are in the authority positions, or even the perhaps retired or older generation, the elders of a family, is we don't talk about that. And that in itself creates issues, discussion, transfer, the baton pass, that image that you kind of put in your head. How many times have we all watched an Olympics where the baton is dropped and it's this tragic loss of excellence? And we don't want that to happen in these family enterprises.
Right. And sometimes I imagine that we're more of a champion for having those conversations than they are. And it's pulling them into the room or setting up the context or coaching them on how to have these difficult conversations. So
that's exactly right. And just in defense of the complexity and the challenge, families are wonderful and incredible, but there is a natural power asymmetry. So you have an older parent. I mean, gosh, in ancient scripture, honor your parents, honor your mother and father. It's something that we have been taught to do as a part of a respect in the dynamics of a family. And because of that, there is an authority instilled in older generations, and then that gets transferred into the authority in the business arena. And there's always sibling dynamics. I mean, we all have sibling dynamics that revert back to when we were 12 and 13 that perhaps sometimes get reemerge in the adult conversations. Family histories have complexity, and you said something really accurate, Jonathan, and that is that lack of readiness, willingness, or even fear of transferring, and some of that is rooted in an older generation's fear of being not relevant and important. And I think that's where we can start to cultivate conversations of saying, where can a family leader have a place and a purpose, but it doesn't necessarily have to be running the business on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Well, legacy is a really interesting question that is probably a foreign word to most entrepreneurs, and having a conversation around their legacy, it probably brings up a lot of maybe spiritual or emotional or maybe nothing, which is even more problematic. But so let's get into some nuts and bolts, right? So we kind of covered a little bit about the why, which is that there's this power and authority and this dynamic, and it could be between siblings, it could be between one generation and the next. But let's get into some of the nuts and bolts of how to have a difficult conversation. So I know I talked a little bit about this in my book, and I know that we shared just before the call some notes you have. Let's start with the idea of giving some advance notice about the topic, like 24 hours before. What are your thoughts on that?
It's so important to frame the conversation and to communicate ahead of time what the person who's initiating the conversation would like to be covered. And it's not just what they want to cover, it's how the approach should be framed. We often recommend suggesting a place to meet that would be a neutral territory, not necessarily in one person's office or another. Again, it depends on the dynamics. A communication of what generally will be talked about without any emotional context, but just topics, not necessarily the end outcome or the goals, but just the areas that should be discussed, so each person can come in prepared. It's also really important to be present in these conversations.
Oh, yeah.
You walk in without your computer on, you turn your phone down. I mean, it's funny. I just saw a video, and I know we're on a Zoom here, but it showed a person speaking and presenting to a group, and then it showed the person presenting like this. And there's just a natural instinct when someone has their phone in their hand or their technology that they're looking at.
Sure.
You're telling someone that they're not as important as what's on the phone.
100%.
So technology needs to be away from the conversation.
Right. Be mindful, folks, if you're going to a restaurant on a date or with your spouse, put the phone away and be an active listener. So important. Let's talk about a situation where you have maybe, let's just call it 4 family members. 2 or 3 of them are working in the business, maybe full, part-time, and 1 is not. And we're talking about, succession and ownership. Do all the parties need to be present in that situation, or do you think it can just happen with the family members who are active in the business, or is it case by case?
In some ways it's case by case, but the reality is it's very important to have all the stakeholders in the business, stakeholders in the room, if the person's in the business or not in the business. We need to be aware of ownership. We need to be aware of authority, and to exclude someone from those conversations is just, it's not going to be able to, it's going to create resentment. It's going to create misinformation, and it's not going to have the right people in the room to make the decisions.
When sometimes I think frustration levels are really high, mostly I think among the rising generation, because they want the baton, they want the power, they want to prove to the family, to the preceding generation that they can run the business. They don't frame up the topic ahead of time in a very clear or succinct fashion. At least that's what I've seen. Or it might come across as there's a lot of anger, as if they're speaking truth to power, and there's frustration coming out. How do you recommend they cue this up with advance notice?
You're really right. And the other thing, Jonathan, is that not only do people approach these issues with so much emotion and preconceived expectations in their head that they almost don't necessarily envision an outcome. And I think that's one of the things that we like to neutralize the environment by recommending: let go of the emotion, let go of the historical anger, frustration, whatever it is, and just think, what would be your ideal outcome? And that's a great way to start the conversation, to think about your mental state as you approach that. But to come in with a listening attitude, to not talk over each other, to not let your emotions elevate, to also recognize if, in fact, they do start to elevate in the room, that you have a moment where you just take a pause, or you can actually have a moment where we say, let's just take a break. Let's walk around the building. It's interesting when you talk about setting up a meeting in a neutral place, and that's a very formal environment. It sounds very funny, but I think sometimes having a difficult conversation outside, walking around.
Yeah.
How many times have you had, Jonathan, a difficult conversation in a car where everyone's looking forward?
Yeah, it doesn't work so well.
Right. And it's not, there's not this connection. There's not this a way to, feel like you're working together.
Yeah. So I think that the key thing that I'm hearing and agree with is you have to remove as many distractions as possible.
Right.
And I think putting yourself in a natural setting, taking it outside of the office or the factory or the warehouse, makes for a healthier environment to do that. But then listening with intentionality. This is a very subtle thing. And this is, I think, sometimes where facilitators, mediators, folks who really understand both parties' positions and points of view can serve an important function, because people tend to react and respond and not read the body language or the messaging that's being given off. And so, like you mentioned about earlier about avoiding immediate rebuttals, so there's the ability and the desire to delete or distract or disrupt or, like just put aside. So be defensive is the word I was looking for. This is really problematic and challenging. And so do you think that a facilitator is required in those situations? Do you think they just need to come back, and do it multiple times and try different ways? What are your thoughts?
No, Jonathan, there's no one perfect answer. I think
Right.
Some of these step-by-step things help to mitigate the uncertainty, mitigate the historical emotional tension, and help to plan for a path forward. I will say, you mentioned this at the beginning, and it really is true. You and I both work along families as advisors, and we're walk along the path with them and have different roles and different times. I do think in some cases where communication is very difficult, often having a facilitator have a pre-call, let someone vent, express all their concerns, and just neutralize all that emotional energy, and then have those conversations with several of the members of the family who may have been involved, and then try to get an alignment of topics so that there is some overlap and goal setting, so that when the conversation does happen with all the stakeholders in the room, in some cases, the facilitator, the advisor would be in the room to help neutralize and coach through the conversation. We often like families having those conversations on their own, but that we've done the pre-call in some ways to help align goals and objectives, and then sometimes have a post-call, because, again, that we'll talk about this hopefully later on, but what the most important thing, the outcome, no matter what the topic is on a difficult conversation, is that there's clarity and that there's an understanding and that there's true communication, so that in some cases it would result in a policy or a decision, or at least reducing the tension and mitigating all the stress and anxiety.
One of the problems still is, even though they might make small commitments or large commitments, that might mean reviewing your estate plan or redoing the estate plan, or, coming up with a sequence steps on the transition, you still encounter intransigence. Someone's not doing what they said they would do. And as coaches, we experience this all the time. People say, yeah, I'm going to do this, is important, but then they're not accountable. And, it particularly comes up when we talk around estate planning or signing your will or doing that kind of, there's many people who don't want to address their own mortality or the eventuality and don't do anything. And they say they're going to do something. This is a problem.
Well, and Jonathan, you make a really good point about estate planning is a very, very common topic. It's a difficult conversation. And in some cases, a younger generation appears to be, money grubber, gold digger, whatever word you want to use, but just that they only ask about it for the money. But really, it's about getting clarity on one's intentions. But the other context is there's a lot of cultural backdrop for certainly death. We had one family that was from the Caribbean that we worked with, and in their culture, talking about death brings on death. And that's really not what we were encouraging, of course, but that we wanted the family to have an approach and clarity on the policies, and certainly, to your point, even have documentation, have it legally, signed and constructed, but there was a real reluctance there because of the culture.
Yeah. All right. So we talked a lot about the how and a little bit about the why. Let's talk a little bit about the what. And the what to me is, what can go wrong? What have you seen gone wrong? You've seen some cautionary tales. Can you share the ugliest of the good, the bad, the ugly? Let's start with the ugly.
Well, here, this was an unfortunate one. It's a lovely, lovely family, and so unfortunately, as they say, the path to hell is led with good intentions. But lovely family, lovely founder, wealth creator of a distribution business, and in the United States, and had wanted to almost, in his mind, I think, he's now passed, I never met him, but protect his family from the business. So they had a policy where the family wasn't even allowed in the business. I mean, literally to come into the office. So the family couldn't come into the office. The spouse knew nothing about the business. The three children had their own businesses. And the forums of connection where they had lovely long traditions of family business, family trips. The father and sons played golf together. So there was a lot of connection and harmony in the family, but they never shared anything about business. And I think the kids were curious, but that was just felt like that was normal. Oh, we don't talk about our business. And then tragically, the father died on an operating table. And what was discovered was that the management team had nefariously been reconstructing some of the management agreements to be able to take out a significant amount of money. The family had seen their distributions drop somewhat, but hadn't really probed into it. The father wasn't keeping as tight a control as he could have. And ultimately, when he passed, the children and the mother had discovered this nefarious behavior and had to engage in very intense, ugly, uncomfortable legal activity, in addition to trying to learn about the business, which they didn't know anything about.
Well, I was always taught that blood is thicker than water. And that means that family members typically trust their family before they trust, management personnel. So that's a really surprising story where the family knew nothing. I was thinking we were going to hear some kind of story of mafia or drug or something crazy like that. But that's a really bad story and a really bad experience. So let's talk about, a successful maybe or a not so good situation, a story. Do you have one?
We have, unfortunately, a couple other situations. This is also a U.S.-based service business and unfortunately, the dialogue about succession planning had never happened. There had been nice conversations about business in the family table, dinner table, and growing up, and there was an expectation that the kids would come into the business at some point. Again, here, a sad health situation where the CEO unexpectedly had a tragic health event and died. And in his will, we've all seen these stories where there's a disclosure in a will, an unexpected disclosure. And in the unexpected disclosure in the will, the father named the second child, not the first child, as the CEO. And that caused friction and tension. And it has been something that has been longstanding and probably can never, ever get completely mitigated. And had the father had the courage to have the conversation when he was alive, perhaps things would have been different. Maybe that ill feeling would still be there, but he didn't. And so it's been a longstanding undercurrent of sadness and friction in this family. We also had another transfer.
By the way, just as a note, for anyone who hasn't seen the Netflix episode series called The Gentleman, this is exactly the story where the second brother gets chosen over the first brother, and the first brother's a lunatic, and it's a very funny, dark, black comedy worth watching.
Well, and I was going to say we had another situation like that where the father unexpectedly named the older son, and the younger son had been working in the business.
Oh.
And ultimately, the younger son left the business and started his own business. And again, that's
not uncommon. I think I've heard multiple times that this has happened where there's discussion among the two generations, and they can't agree. And they either agree to disagree and stay stuck, or one goes out on their own, and usually the younger person. And sometimes these even create lawsuits. One of my guests, the Gelati family, tells the story of it's a multi-generational construction business in the North Bay in San Francisco area. And there are 4 Gelati families that are in the construction business that have all split apart. I think the Mondavi family, which is a multi-generational wine business, is similarly split apart, and they end up sometimes competing with each other. It's quite bizarre.
Well, I'm connecting with you today, Jonathan, from Texas, and Texas is very proud about a lot of our heritage. One of which is barbecue. Mm-hmm. And there's a very famous family, Blacks family here in Texas, that have a long tradition of great barbecue. But that family also has had 2 separate paths, and so there's one path and another path, so you have to make sure you even get to the right direction. These are things that happen in families that don't have to necessarily be bad or mean-spirited. It's okay to, as I mentioned before, so many of these businesses, the roots of the wealth comes from taking risk and an entrepreneur having a great idea. So cultivating that and celebrating that is a good thing. So as opposed to having a schism where people break away with negative feelings, alternately, a dialogue that says, how could we actually make this happen in a positive way, I think is actually a much more productive, on all levels. It's more productive for the family, the harmony, role modeling good behavior, demonstrating entrepreneurial activity and taking risk is a good thing, and ultimately can actually create more wealth for the collective family.
Well, when I wrote my book and then launched the podcast, and then titled it all Disruptive Successor, I think it was a bit of an absurd concept that a next generation or third generation, whatever that might be in the family, was going to truly be entrepreneurial and was going to truly be disruptive. Those are oftentimes more rare to find those people, as opposed to those who just want to carry on the tradition. And disruptive isn't always good if it looks like someone, if it's at the destruction of the family harmony. So my intent was there would be family harmony and there would be a disruptive successor who would take the business to a whole new level. But I haven't found it. Maybe it was a bit of an absurd concept.
Well, it's interesting that you say that. I mentioned we were just in Dubai. We were working with a family in Saudi, and the term that they use for a constitution or policies is a protocol. Mm-hmm. And this is a family that has great wealth. They've actually codified or institutionalized that sense of disruptor culture by allowing for, again, talking about the extreme of we don't talk about it, they talk about everything in their constitution. I think it's 50 pages, and one of which is they have a protocol that says we have funds available for rising gens to learn about business. We have funds available to design a platform where you can have an advisor come in and help you put together a business plan. And then we have a council to whom you can present an idea and say, I would like some funding. So the council can almost be like the family bank. And the family bank has rules of borrowing and returning capital. And then there can be coaching added onto that. So that, again, they cultivate that sense of disruptor that you're hoping to talk about. Yep. And it just gives a pathway. And, we talked about the how and some of the unfortunate situations that we've seen where people didn't have these conversations and what has happened. What can happen, and, having these little phrases, is, clarity is kindness is one of the things we say. Mm-hmm. Giving some pathways and understanding to break through these difficult topics and start to address them and start to create some alignment and understanding, and then perhaps scaffolding it with family constitution, policies, procedures. Of course, you get to that next level of legal scaffolding, excuse me, and we talked about estate planning. there's a couple other things we can talk about that you can do to kind of scaffold this aligned upon or agreed upon approach and platform.
Let's talk about some of that scaffolding. And but I do want to just go back to this program that your client put together that supported the rising gen in being entrepreneurial and coming with business ideas. I was at a family business conference about a year ago, and it was a recent grad from college or business school speaking from a company that I had worked with 20 plus years ago, a large bakery in King's Hawaiian Bakery. Probably many people know the name, and they've survived or thrived on almost a single product item, which is their sweet rolls. And so the younger generation were constantly coming up with ideas, and the family decided, well, let's put together like a venture capital entrepreneur training program. They brought in an outside trainer, and these people were taught to put together business plans, and then they could present those business plans to the council. Lovely idea. So our great minds are thinking alike here in different parts of the globe. All right, so let's talk about scaffolding. There's a lot of, maybe that might be a term that people are like, well, what did she mean exactly by that? But there's a lot of things that you can put together that relate to buy, sell, ownership, succession plan documents, maybe estate planning, dividend, that talk about dividend distribution policy. Walk us through some of that, please.
Sure. Again, if you were to categorize the two big topics that people don't want to talk about, it's really power and money. And power is really the authority to make decisions in the business and the ownership. And what we strongly recommend, as opposed to having conflict, I quit, I want to disappear, and I'm going to sell my shares, to have a platform that would allow people to have normal access and understanding of who can own the shares, how can they be bought and sold. That the phrase buy sell is really a legal agreement that frames out who can buy the shares, permitted transferees. One of the issues that we often have a conversation about is in-laws, and we can talk about that in a minute. We often have recommendations for prenups. You and I spoke about that before. We also have recommend policies on distributions. So again, power of making the decisions and ownership, and then what happens with the money from the assets.
And how do they get these conversations started? I mean, these are difficult conversations. And again, I think part of why it's difficult is because people don't really have a structure for how to for what to talk about and what an outcome looks like. And, maybe there's confusion even around, like, so what does this lead to? Does this lead to an estate planning document or a buy-sell agreement or an insurance policy? Or I think this is where a lot of confusion lies.
Jonathan, you're exactly right. And look, the other thing is, so many of these business owners are running the business. Mm-hmm. They don't actually have the time capacity or potential ability to envision what the outcome could be, because they're just on a daily basis running their business. And then they've got siblings, and then it just gets too complicated, so it gets put to the side. We had one family I just talked about that we're going to likely do business with, and they're in India. And I said to the brother, I said, have you talked to your brother about this? And he said, 4 years ago we did. And I thought, well, that's a long time. Clearly, you're talking about accountability partners. That right. is one of the things that I think, you and I and our teams do for our families, which is we do keep them on track for accountability on these issues, because, it goes back to this, it's hard to do everything in one conversation. The starter conversation often breaks the ice and starts to frame out the conversation. Having an outside independent person who isn't representing one member of the family. I mean, I'm sure you're sensitive to this too with the families that you work with. I'm always extraordinarily sensitive to having a clear and genuine relationship with all the members of the family, particularly the owners of the business, because I don't want to represent one person. Right. If I come in and just represent one person, I'm not working towards the best alignment of everyone's interest.
What makes sense to me is I'm thinking about the scaffolding, because I love the term scaffolding because it's temporary, but also could be a permanent structure. And so as I'm thinking about this, certain things you might put together, a buy-sell agreement, like that might not be the first version of the buy-sell agreement. Why not get something in place at least for now? It's good enough for now, and then let's move on to employment policies and practices, and then let's move on to dealing with in-laws and employment policies, and let's just keep putting things together, and then we can go back to the beginning and look. It's the buy-sell agreement. What's your thoughts on like layering this and making this an ongoing part of working on the business, if you will? It's a chapter that needs to be revisited.
I 100% agree with you. Active oversight and governance revisits are absolutely important. I mean, you can't be in permanent drafting mode with lawyers, but doing, as they say, the perfect is the enemy of the good. People think they can get something that's perfect. You're not going to. Your family's going to change. Your children are going to grow up. There's going to be a new dynamic. I share this. My wonderful husband, Paul, and I are celebrating our 24th anniversary in June of being married. And we have 3 children. We have done our estate planning 3 times.
Right.
And so what does that mean? Every 8 years you do it?
Yeah.
Kinda.
Yeah.
And I think, is that a good rule of thumb? 5 to 10 years? Yeah. I think that's a really smart thinking. It's interesting, Jonathan, many of our families that approach us that are ready to start to have these conversations. We can kind of, as they say, lead the horse to water, but when they approach us for a deep dive engagement, their children are between the ages of 22 and 35. The adults are starting to see the more fully formed young children into young adults, and they're starting to think about what's going to be their role, what is our family policy about employment, what type of ownership transfers do we want to talk to them about. Again, there's lots of legal terminology that you don't just get right away. You have to learn, you have to understand, and you have to be informed. And so, there's an age appropriateness of these things. Maybe it's not 21, but I had a conversation with some friends recently, and the husband has been a very successful tech executive here in Austin now, but in San Francisco, and his kids are in their mid to late 30s. They have children in their 10 and under, and they're very active grandparents, and the husband's still an active business executive. And he said, when do you think I should start having conversations with my kids about our estate? And I thought, already.
Right.
And I said that to him, and it was not in a mean-spirited way, but I said, you've got to start to have those conversations.
Yep. All right. Let me try some rapid fire questions here. What's your experience about in-laws? Are they in or are they out? What do you recommend as far as like transfer policies?
We generally do not recommend that in-laws can have any ownership in the business. Here's a perfect little pop culture example. Ted Lasso.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
sure.
Rebecca.
Right.
Inherits the beloved football club. Is she want to build the business, or does she want to burn it to the ground?
Right.
She wants to burn it to the ground at the beginning.
Okay. So they're out. Spouses, in or out?
It's interesting that you say that, Jonathan. I think ownership of the business, we generally do not recommend. Same reason. Having said that, we also often incorporate language in permitted transferees that would allow a spouse to benefit from shares being transferred to their children. So a father, sometimes the mother, transfers the ownership to their children through a trust. And the distributions from that trust, the spouse can live on. In other words,
that's great.
The CEO dies, his long-standing spouse should be able to live on the distributions from the business, but they won't own them.
Right. Good. Okay. Another rapid-fire question. Dividends, distributions. Is there a healthy percentage to reinvest in the business? What's that number?
See, Jonathan, it's a great question. And I think there's no magic number. I think you want to look at your cash flow needs of the business. You want to look at your operating needs. You also need to look at your consumption needs. we have seen one family that we worked with did not have this policy, and unfortunately, the business bought back shares from one of the disgruntled family members. Distributions were still getting pulled out, and they strangled the business, and the business failed. So I think allowing for distributions to support consumption, but with a recognized, consumption in some of our families can also have egregious excess.
Right.
So there needs to be a thoughtful design to consumption needs in order to sustain the capital needed for the business.
Okay. I was thinking somewhere 40 to 60% reinvestment policy or practice, but don't have a fixed number. Just, and I think your answer is right. It depends, but it can't be egregious.
No. And we've seen a 20% retention, and that's a very conservative number for the family. Distribution retention. And so I think that your range is absolutely within a good guidance.
Right. Okay. Any other specific employment policies that come to mind? Part of the scaffolding.
Especially for the next gen, it's really important for them to understand their pathways. We strongly recommend that next gen are required to work outside the business for 3 to 5 years. We had one family that had 15 years as the number, and we thought that was just a little too long.
That's too long.
You get distracted. You get your love affair with the business just falls apart. So 3 to 5 is the range we generally recommend. There's also some tactics that we would say that family members don't necessarily report to other family members early on in their career. We recommend having a designated mentor that's not a family member. We also, another platform for net rising gens is we have created in several families a board observer rule, so that if they're not necessarily in the business, they start to learn about the business without having that authority of the fiduciary role to have a vote in the room, but that they would start to learn about the business.
I like that idea. I think many of the smaller businesses that I have come into contact with over the years, they've had no outside experience, the rising gen, and their only experience is in the business. And I have a client today who actually non-family members, they have been there for 18 years, 20 years, the only job they've ever had. So what do you do when you run into a situation where you're walking into a company where this has already happened? Like they haven't had outside experience. You don't send them outside somehow, but you're suggesting they get maybe a mentor, someone who helps guide them, educate them?
It's one family that we worked with ended up having the oldest member of the family was a young person. He was in his mid-20s, and the father wanted to retire in 10 years. And what the father did was brought in an external person to serve just as a mentor to that young person. And so they literally had a 5-year plan where he worked in the business I think he ended up working in the business for 3 years. And then he was designated as the future CEO privately, not necessarily to the full company, because that kind of changes, again, that power dynamics, but that he had an external mentor that would meet with him regularly. I think it was almost weekly. And they learned to develop skill sets, exposures, understanding. And this young man was appreciative of having an external person because it didn't change the dynamics with his father.
Amazing. Maryann, you're a wealth of knowledge and experience. You're very passionate about the subject. Tell us and the listeners a little bit about Wingspan Legacy Partners. You're working globally, it sounds like. Yeah. You're in Dubai, you're in India, you're in the Caribbean. How exciting. And maybe even have some stuff in Austin or the U.S. Tell us a little bit more about it.
We absolutely have families in Texas that we have just as much affection for. We are almost a 4-year-old advisory. We were founded by Christina Wing, who is a professor at Harvard Business School. She designed an academic platform called Demystifying the Family Enterprise, and she teaches MBAs each year. She also serves as the lead professor in several exec ed programs. One's Families in Business, which is a really interesting multi-generational platform. She has a specific family office platform, and then the most recent one is a Rising Gen platform. So she does that at Harvard, and many of her students, both MBAs as well as execs, have said, would you come and advise us? So that was the starting granule of Wingspan. And since then, we've worked with families, as you mentioned, certainly throughout the United States. We have a few families in Europe. We have spent quite a bit of time in Dubai, and Dubai is a central place for families from India and from all over the Middle East and North Africa region. And we work with families on different types of constructions. Generally speaking, these are families looking to have an engaged dialogue and guidance on governance construction.
And tell us the size and like the scope of Wingspan. How many folks are there? Where are your locations?
We have 12 members of our team. We are in Boston, New York, and Austin, and we are in the process right now of opening up an office in Dubai.
Fabulous. Thanks so much for being on the show today. I hope, folks, that you got some real value from this and that it's starting to tilt the wheels in favor of having conversations that are difficult, queuing them up. I certainly have a resource, a whole chapter in my book on how to have difficult conversations and tools. There are some great books out there that have been written about how to have difficult conversations. And then Maryann, of course, is a resource if you've got probably a larger, maybe global company. Great to have you on the show, Maryann.
My pleasure. Good to see you, Jonathan.
All right. Come back again soon.
Take care.
This podcast is sponsored by myself, Jonathan Goldhill, and my company, the Goldhill Group, where we provide coaching for growing companies. I'm Jonathan Goldhill, and my purpose is simple: to guide entrepreneurial leaders in family businesses towards more freedom and fulfillment. I want entrepreneurs to get clarity around the changes that will make them and their businesses more successful so they can experience the same freedom I've enjoyed in my life. Our proven practices challenge business owners to think differently about their business and how they're running it, and quite literally become game changers in our clients' companies. Learn more at thegoldhillgroup.com website, where you can schedule your free strategy session. Thank you for joining us on the Disruptive Successor podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, review, and share with a friend who would benefit from the message. If you're interested in picking up a copy of my book, Disruptive Successor, go to disruptivesuccessor.com.